Welcome everyone to Fireside Chats with Candidates. And this evening, the candidate that we're speaking with is Brad Hoylman, who's currently a New York State Senator. In fact, Senator Hoylman is the head of the Judiciary Committee. And as such, he's created a lot of legislation that's very, very beneficial. He created the Child Victims Act, which enables people that were sexually assaulted as children to go back. I think it's a two-year window. Am I correct, Senator?
Yeah. That's right.
Also, adults are being addressed by a recent bill that Senator Hoylman introduced that gives I think a 1-year look back. Am I correct?
Correct.
And those are for civil cases. We have a lot of people here who have been victimized by sexual assault and wanted to meet you this evening. We have Andrea Constand, who is the person who Bill Cosby is now in jail for having violated. We also have Mimi Haley. I think that Tarale Wulff is probably going to be joining us shortly. We also have Don Dunning, who was a Molyneux witness in the Weinstein case. And Susan Prout is here. She's the mother of Chessie, who was victimized at St. Paul's school. And so a lot of people that have a considerable interest in the work that you've done in sexual assault. They also have a considerable interest in getting consent defined in the laws of New York State. And I know that you know that Senator Sanders recently introduced Bill 6200, is the Senate bill. 6540 is the Assembly bill, and would be very interested in seeing you co-sponsor that bill. Have you read the bill?
I'm familiar with it. Yes, I haven't read it word for word, but I'm very familiar with its description and its intention.
Right, because it's pretty simple. It's that consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No, I appreciate your pointing it out to me for sure. I could tell you more about how the legislation is looking if you'd be interested to hear.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and thank you for all of the survivors on this call. This is very moving to see people gathered with the intention of, transforming pain into better policy for the state of New York. And Joyce, I just want to thank you for your intellectual guidance on this topic, which is really vexing from a policymaking standpoint for so many years. In fact, the Republicans controlled the Senate for the better part of 100 years in Albany. And finally, when we as Democrats were able to regain control, we made the Child Victims Act, the bill that I helped draft and carried for 6 years, a priority. And now that has gone into effect for a 1-year look back period for those who are minors and who were sexually assaulted. They now have an additional year because we wanted to give a grace period due to COVID and the inability for adult survivors to seek redress during the pandemic. What's crazy about our statutes of limitations, I'm sure many of you know, is that until we changed the legislation around child sexual assault, you had only until about the age of 23 years to file a claim. There are very, very few young adults who have that kind of wherewithal to be able to understand the fact that they had been assaulted and figure out how to pursue justice, hire a lawyer, take on a trusted member of their community or family, like a relative or a priest or a coach. So I'm very pleased to say that since the Child Victims Act was passed, over 5,000 of these cases have been brought in the state of New York, and more to come. And institutions, as I'm sure you've read about, are being held accountable too for their cover-ups and complicity. We want to do something similar with the Adult Survivor Act, which would recognize the fact that we have extended the statutes of limitation, both from a criminal and civil perspective, prospectively. And as a result, there are many adult survivors who never had the chance to take on their accuser. So the Adult Survivor Act will provide that 1 year look back window as well. New Jersey passed it a year ago when they extended their statutes, both criminal and civil prospectively. So I think we should do the same. It doesn't make any sense you go just across the Hudson and you have a different consequence and justice. But you know, I'm running for Manhattan Borough President, as I'm sure you know. This is, I think, an example of the kind of fights I want to lead here in the city, to the extent that it's about taking on powerful forces, whether it be real estate, Wall Street, the insurance companies, institutions like churches and yeshivas. Somebody's got to stand up and fight. And boy, the stakes are really high here in the city as we battle our way out of COVID. So while I won't be legislating on the level of the Child Victims Act as the president of the Borough of Manhattan, I will be able to introduce legislation and I hope to be a guiding force on so many critical issues to Manhattanites and Roosevelt Islanders, including development and making certain that our city services are responsive to the public.
Excellent. Yes, Susan.
Thank you so much, Joyce, and thank you, Senator, for those really brave words. And we applaud all the work you've done to date. We've been watching you from all corners of the United States and watching you extend that, the act that you did. And that's awesome news about the COVID extension for people. We know a lot of people who fought with you on that. I just want to say that, you know, my husband's a lifelong New Yorker. We're up here on the Upper East Side, although we've lived all over the world. And my daughter's now at Columbia in Barnard getting her degrees. She'll be graduating in 1 more year. And Chessie was 15 years old when she was sexually assaulted at St. Paul's School. And a couple of interesting tidbits to note: we could not find a law firm in New York City to represent us when she was assaulted, and we wanted to take on the complicit institution of St. Paul's School. Then we finally found a law firm in Baltimore. So Chessie did take on St. Paul's and her perpetrator in both civil and criminal. She was a witness in a criminal case. And I have to say, the judge in the case said to her, it's clear that Ms. Prout did not consent. And yet her perpetrator was not found guilty of a felony. He was found guilty. They were very creative in New Hampshire. They charged him with a felony use of a computer to lure a minor for sexual purposes. So the jury split the verdict. And this is in 2015. And had there been a consent law anywhere in the United States, it would have been a very different outcome for her court case. As you know, many prominent New Yorkers go to St. Paul's School, and you know, from Robert Mueller to John Kerry to Congressman Stubbs, many people that live on the Upper East Side here go to St. Paul's School, and they are watching and they are noting that perpetrators can still get away with these things. We need a basic penal code that addresses that. We need a culture shift, and we need to start with the basics in our law to give us some gender equity I have 3 daughters. I have 2 daughters that went to St. Paul's. My husband graduated from St. Paul's School, and it was the last thing we ever thought would happen to my highly educated, just frankly, really strong young women. And so, in meeting Joyce and reading her book and understanding what we're dealing with, the rest of the world is taking note. You've got Australia looking at this and trying to mandate a federal definition of consent. Mm-hmm. You've got the UK, you've got Ireland, you've got Canada looking at this, and we are lagging behind. We are lagging behind in the United States. We need definition of consent in our penal code, Joyce's definitions, not something that's very weak like they've done in a couple places. So this is a chance to turn the tide, and we need everybody. It's wonderful to do all these other measures, but this is a very basic core thing that we need to happen. And we just thank you in advance for any support you can give it.
Thank you so much, Susan. Great words of support. Unfortunately, another issue when you're talking about civil cases is that unless the offender has considerable assets, it's very difficult to get an attorney, a civil attorney, to actually try the case because there's just no payday for them. So unless we actually implement the changes that are needed in our penal code, then most sexual assault victims are just totally without justice, and the offenders are without accountability. And so it's absolutely essential that we get this done. And I think,
Yeah, that's a really good point, Joyce. And survivors, by the way, let me just say, the reason we got this bill passed, the initial Child Victims Act passed in Albany, is because of the stories like your daughter shared with the court and people in power. And survivors' stories, it has to be so incredibly painful to relive that every time you're forced to retell what is no doubt probably the most painful experience of one's life, to have their innocence stolen from them, as is the case in so many circumstances. So I just want to acknowledge survivors and thank you and your families for making this possible for so many other New Yorkers and indeed people across the country. I was motivated in part by a little bit of popular culture. The film Spotlight really showed me how the cover-up was so far-reaching in the church. Mm-hmm. And secondly, I had a constituent who approached me on the street and told me that he had been abused, first groomed and then abused by his high school coach. And by the time he finished the story, he and I were both near tears. And I said that was, the most worst, thing I could ever imagine for a young person. And he said, no, Senator, the worst thing is that my former coach is actually still teaching at my high school. And what we've done, in addition to allowing survivors to seek justice and have some peace of mind and some ability to reclaim part of their lives, they've allowed law enforcement to help identify these perpetrators, who many of whom still were in contact with young people, just as this high school coach was. So I want to thank you, Susan, and my heart really goes out to you and your daughter and your family, but appreciate everything you're doing.
Thank you.
And the issue of finding an attorney, which is what you raised and what Joyce just followed up on, is very difficult. If you are judgment proof. As a defendant, you're right. A trial attorney probably isn't going to be that interested in a case because there is no payout. There's no way to
It wasn't that. It was against St. Paul's School, which has an endowment that is bigger than the economy of New Hampshire.
So that in that instance, it was just a matter of sheer being intimidated, not willing to
sheer power. It was the extensive network of a school that has people in the highest echelons of government and everywhere. But I would just say to you, to that end, we called months and months and months, and finally they called us, and our daughter was able to write a book with Jen Abelson of the Spotlight team. And unfortunately, her book is huge and it's a really long story. And it's just the tip of the iceberg. I now run a nonprofit called I Have the Right To, which is how I met Joyce and the Consent Awareness Network. And I hear stories all day, every day, from teenagers, their families, whose lives are decimated by sexual assault. My husband lost his job twice because St. Paul's tenterhooks found him and corrupted his work environment at Morgan Stanley and all these other, amazing places right here in New York. I mean, the decrepitness is that, it's that intrepid here in the city. Yeah,
no, I can see that. The other end of the spectrum is the powerless, and most sexual assault of minors occurs in the family context, and that's where, as Joyce was pointing out, it might be hard to find an attorney who isn't going to receive any remuneration for their work and their research and their time into a matter. So some have raised that to us as an ongoing concern, and perhaps it's time for legislatures to look at victim defense funds or build in some sort of pool of money in our state budgets to allow these cases to move forward, or to at least have, say, legal services attorneys to be funded specifically to pursue these kinds of claims. That's something that has been raised to me as a considerable problem. But your problem, Susan, is the other extreme, which is a wealthy and powerful institution that frankly intimidated attorneys from taking them on.
Right. And we certainly, acknowledge my daughter is blonde and blue-eyed and acknowledges her privilege. And so that's why we're here as a nonprofit, wanting to share our roadmap with anyone else. And I would just say this, Senator, the law is so important in the fabric of our society. What we're really trying to do right now is to change the culture, to do a paradigm shift from the way, women have been dealt with for centuries, for decades and decades, to a culture of consent that basically will take away all the isms, misogyny, racism, sexism, childism. We're talking about a culture of dignity. And that's what this consent, law is aiming for. It's huge. It is culture shifting. So, I mean, it's not a small thing. It's not just, the Prout's lawsuit against St. Paul's or, any number of us here on the call. It's much, much bigger than any one of our cases. We're talking about a culture shift. And why not have New York lead it?
Yeah. Mimi, I know you had kind of an interesting circumstance happening when the jury asked the judge for guidance about consent. Can you possibly relate to the senator what the judge had to say?
This is such an important topic, and I'm glad.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Senator. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you, Joyce, as well. Yeah, no, I just, because it is quite shocking. I was quite shocked to learn that there wasn't a definition for consent. And so I think both in the Weinstein criminal trial, as well as the Cosby trial, when the jury were asked, or when the jury asked the judge for like a definition of consent. In both cases, they were told to use their common sense, which to me is quite shocking. And because of course, common sense means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, right? And I just think that if there was a very, very clear, simple definition for what consent actually is, it would clear up a lot of what people perceive as problematic or confusing circumstances, when the truth is that, you know, most abusers know their victims, and there's a lot of kind of relations and different dynamics going on. But I just think that if there was a very, very clear definition, it would clear up so much of those questions that jurors will have, and people in general as well.
That's a good point.
Yeah, keep in mind also that the definition in both 6200 and 6540 are actually being introduced in general law. And so it becomes clear that consent is consent in all things. And we don't change what consent is for somebody's convenience. It's the same freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement when you're taking somebody's property, or when you're kidnapping their child, when you're putting your information on the internet, when you're getting your COVID vaccination, or when you're sexually assaulting someone. So, you know, it needs to be clear that the same consent that we teach our children as they're growing up is the same concept of consent that applies when you're doing anything that is deemed illegal under New York's penal code. And so it's really essential that we have this guidance that enables people to understand clearly that consent is consent in all things, and what consent actually is. All of the above.
Yeah, you know, I think the reason why we haven't moved this bill because there are some inherent difficulties with, well, for example, the power dynamic, right? Even though someone may, expressly acknowledge consent, how can they be said to have agency when there is, say, an employer-employee relationship, or a priest and an altar boy, or, well, obviously a minor is something very different. But in the case of someone who's on a movie set with a powerful producer, I don't know. What do you think of that, Joyce? Like, how does that work into the definition?
Actually, quite easily, Senator, because consent is not simply what people, what people say. Consent is what influenced you to go along with, or to be complicit with, or cooperate with the behavior. If the person is using force or fear or fraud in order to elicit your agreement, then your agreement is not consent. There are other forms of agreement. As I'm sure you know, there's assent, which is agreement on the face of it. And there's acquiescence, which is agreement under duress. But only consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. So if someone is using malice in order to undermine your self-determination, they know that they've done so. This is not confusion. They deliberately set out to either force you or coerce you, and you might not know it at the time. And that's why the words and actions, our laws right now state that the words and conduct of the victim is what determines whether or not a person consents. And that kind of words and actions concept completely flies in the face of what consent actually is. Consent is a state of mind. that occurs when you're freely giving knowledgeable and informed agreement. So when the offender is using malice in order to get you to agree, you could be assenting, agreeing on the face of it. You could be acquiescing, agreeing under duress, and that's typical of what Weinstein did and what happens in a power dynamic, right? In a power dynamic, the person is using their power differential in a nefarious way in order to undermine your self-determination, right? And they know that they're doing that, right? It's not something that's accidental. It's a deliberate act to undermine your self-determination. Larry Nassar tricked his victims. He did it deliberately. There was nothing confusing in his mind. There was only confusion in the mind of his victims. And even though they agreed, we can't say that they consented because they didn't freely give knowledgeable and informed agreement. And if we get it across to society that consent is freely given knowledgeable and informed agreement, then we're now putting the onus on the shoulders of the offender and not on the victim. And so the ability of the victim, the ability of the defense attorney to tear apart the manner of dress or the character of the victim, that's just thrown out as baseless in a court of law. So we stop the victim blaming by understanding that if someone is using a malicious way to undermine your self-determination, then they are not securing consent, even if you say it's okay. And, Judge Knock, I know, has something that he could add in regard to that, because, I think that Judge Knock understands this concept of influence and the impact that influence would have in changing the dynamic that happens in court. That it no longer is the result of what a person says, but what the offender does in order to elicit your compliance, right? Did you want to add something there, Judge Knock?
Thank you very much, Joyce. It's always an honor to be with you, and always an honor in any quarter and for any reason to be in the same forum with Honorable Brad Hoylman, who is not just one of the finest civil servants I know, but one of the finest human beings I know. So, Senator, thank you for what you do. It's really an honor, and with all of our friends tonight. I've been listening carefully to Susan and to Mimi and to Andrea, and it's just light bulb after light bulb. The senator asked you, Joyce, what is there in the bill, both in the Assembly Bill 6540 and in this one, the Senate Bill 6200, that really gets to the point of it. And you're right, Joyce. What you did was you quoted the actual language of the legislation defining consent as, quote, freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. But you know what? The bill goes further, and it contains a clarification. And the clarification states, quote, it also identifies certain malicious influences. We heard Joyce mention that word, and that's a word that I've used in this context. And that goes to the agency issue that the senator mentioned. It's not just about, and I could read for you case after case after case of incredibly puzzling court decisions from some of the most respected appellate division districts, thankfully not ones in New York City, that have just, when talking about consent, completely miss the point about what about someone who's involved in an overbearing influence. That language in this draft, in this bill, is so critical. malicious influences that if used to obtain a victim's agreement, so in other words, the bill is acknowledging that there was an agreement. However, if it was used to obtain a victim's agreement, such agreement could not be considered as consent. They are forcible compulsion, duress, coercion. Those are two key words here, duress, coercion, when we're talking about what the senator talked about, what Mimi talked about, when you've lost your agency, deception, fraud, concealment, or artifice. We heard Mimi say the shocking statement by the charging judge in that case, telling the, and by the way, in a jury trial, my friends, there's not much the judge has to do, okay? It's the jury that does the heavy lifting. The judge has two responsibilities, only two, to make rulings on the admissibility of evidence and to charge the jury, all right? To tell a jury, figure it out, I'm dumbfounded by it, dumbfounded by it. At a bare minimum, the court should, I think, should have spent more time soliciting the attorney's opinions on what the charge ought to be. But I'd like to say that I've done a survey. I've done a survey of the various laws that talk about consent. And the most analogous, from at least a civil standpoint, is the tort of battery. And battery can be found, the definition for battery can be found in the pattern jury instructions at section 3.3. And it's an intentional tort, and it involves a person who intentionally touches another person without that person's consent, et cetera, et cetera. You can see the analogy. Guess what, my friends? The word intent in that pattern jury instruction is defined at least 8 times in the instruction and at least 6 pages of commentary. Not one word about the definition of consent. It's shocking.
Yeah.
It's shocking. So it's the culture, you know, we heard Susan talk about a change in the culture. We're living in a culture of what is, you know, examining the offender. What was the offender's intent? What was the offender's act? Oh, there's plenty of law about that. Cases and cases and truckloads of cases. I will challenge you to find a modicum of explanation or guidance from jurists, from statutes that take the trouble to focus, as Susan says, a paradigm shift to the victim. What is the victim thinking? Let me shock you by telling you this. In the overwhelming bulk of cases that I've studied while working with Joyce on this issue, you will find that the courts focus on, and I'm going to quote one from an appellate court, quote, knowing the nature of her act, such plaintiff shall not be rewarded for her indiscretion. I nearly fainted when I read that. Knowing the nature of her act, meaning, well, she gave consent, or in any case, he gave consent, whatever it might be. Is that all we look for? You know, Mimi talked about, again, the judge saying, figure it out. This is what happens when you let people just figure it out. And smart people too. And I assume even well-meaning people. If it's just left in this amorphous state of figure it out, you can be left with decisions like this that are anathema to anything that I think any right-thinking person thinks. Was there, you know, did the person say yes? Great. Well, the inquiry does not end there. There has to be a paradigm shift, as Susan mentioned, and the law has to begin to search for definitions for consent, which we have none of. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I want to note that another appellate division case, again, thankfully not from our great city area, and by the way, a late 20th century case where the allegation was, ladies and gentlemen, a psychiatrist was alleged to have had sexual intercourse with a patient. Now think of this. The patient is already a vulnerable victim because the patient, it was a female patient, was visiting a psychiatrist, a licensed physician. The allegation was, the claim was a claim for rape, rightfully so. The trial court denied a motion to dismiss. Good for them, right? Would you be shocked if I told you the appellate division reversed the denial of dismissal by hair splitting as follows? The hair splitting was, well, you know, what the doctor did was he induced the woman to surrender to his sexual desires. That's a quote. Induced the woman to surrender. So she surrendered to his sexual desires, and the court concluded that is called seduction, and there's no real cause of action in the state of New York for seduction. Folks, I'm not trying to shock you, but I guess I am trying to shock you a little bit. This is how far afield we get when, as Mimi said, folks say, leave it to your own analysis, leave it to your own deduction. I don't want to take up a lot of time. And of course, the senator who we love, we want to hear from him about his aspirations, who we support. But I just want to end off by saying this. The couple of examples that I provided are a drop in the bucket. I have found scores and scores of decisions from respected courts that have shocked me. And I have found scores and scores of pattern jury instructions, which are published by the Committee on Pattern Jury Instructions Association of Justices of the Supreme Court of the State of New York. All right? And you will find tons of definitions about what the aggressor or what the offender has to have in mind in order to hold him or her accountable. You will find barely nothing, nary a thread of guidance on the victim and did that victim, regardless of whether or not he or she said yes or surrendered to the act, did that person feel in his or her heart that he or she had no choice? And that's where the language of the bill comes in. Freely given, all right? Duress, coercion. These are the things, and I applaud Joyce for her efforts, all of you for your efforts, Assemblywoman Seawright down in the Assembly, and Senator Sanders, and every person of goodwill who's looking at these bills. We need this more than ever for so many reasons. So I'll stop now, but I just want to tell you how honored I am that I was invited by Joyce and to be with such fine folks as yourself. And Senator, always a pleasure to be with you, sir.
There are different types of agreement, and when the judge or the jury or the prosecutor or the defense attorney, when they establish that an agreement was made, they think that that agreement proves that that person consented. No, it doesn't. Consent is a very specific type of agreement. It's freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. And that's the only kind of agreement that should warrant sexual contact. Allie just pointed something out to me, and I want to make that, include that in here, and that is that over 100 mentions of the word consent in our penal code with zero definition for consent. And going back and applying freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement will clarify every single one of those statutes. It won't confuse it. It will clarify every single one of them. And it's not only imperative for sexual assault, it's imperative for sex trafficking. It's imperative for revenge porn. It's imperative for everything, for larceny, for burglary, for every crime. We need to know what constitutes consent. And I'm sorry, I'm standing on my soapbox again, and I know Ellen is anxious to get on with some other issues. Is there one more person that wants to say something that hasn't been mentioned about this issue?
I did just want to say, if I may, thank you for having me here. And Senator Hoylman, it's really nice to spend this time with you and also hear about your work. And as you shared the statistics earlier about what you've done and the changes it's already made, imagine how much more change it takes all of us to digest everything as the public and feel empowered enough. And that change does take time. So I can only imagine more of the good that's going to come from the work that you've already done. And as Susan has already said, that the archaic language of, as Joyce mentioned, of words and actions has created this victim blaming society. And by changing that definition, we will be able to raise a new brood of human beings that understand what consent is and empower both boys and girls and children on the school ground to understand what consent is. And that is the culture change that Susan was talking about. And it seems very parallel to what you're already doing. So I just think that they sort of support and uplift each other. And I really appreciate your time today and having me here.
Thank you, Tarale. Okay. So Ellen, up to you. Let's go on to some.
So I'm going to have the flame.
Okay.
Fake flame.
That's
Okay.
our fun. We really try to embody the concept of fireside chats, except here on Roosevelt Island, nobody has a fireplace. And I ran out of matches tonight, so I couldn't light my candle. But there's Ellen has her reasonable facsimile at hand.
And I'm afraid of fire, so this is the best I can do. Okay. So Brad, it is wonderful to have you here. Thank you. I am the big question I have is, why would you give up a position that you're so good at and you've made such a difference in? And I know that the borough president is a very important position as well, but it's term limited. So what you hope to accomplish that's that important that you would give up the important job you already have?
Well, thank you. I've been in the Senate for 9.5 years. So I believe that there is a natural cycle to a lot of things, including one's professional endeavors and in public life too. But also the challenges that we're facing as a borough are so huge. The challenges we're facing as a city are just, once in a generation after COVID, with a third to a half of our small businesses not making it, with the rise in homelessness and drug use on our streets, and the risks to our children as and our public schools, and the need to have a sensible development policy, because the pressures, Ellen, are going to be enormous on Manhattan, including Roosevelt Island, to develop and to push forward with new development, given the fact that over 60% of New Yorkers have lost income, and we have such daunting economic forces at work. So I think the role of the borough president is central to the next few years in this city, and particularly this borough. So it's an enormous challenge, and frankly, I think I've got the record, the best record of the folks who are running to meet that challenge. So it's an exciting opportunity, but it's also such an important job as someone who's going to be at the heart of so many conversations about the future of Manhattan. I mean, we have 50 million square feet of empty office space in Midtown. We should be looking at converting some of that to supportive and affordable housing. we have school children who 15% of them or more who are dyslexic and have never learned to read. Like my daughter, who wasn't until she was in the 4th grade did it dawn on us that maybe we should get her tested for that, which is one of the reasons why I want to use the borough president's considerable expenditure funds to institute universal dyslexia screening for all kindergartners in Manhattan as a really important step for parents to be empowered and know whether their child has this learning difference or not. And we look at the fact that so many tenants, particularly those who are rent stabilized, are fearful of not just eviction, but being able to pay the rent. And will have to negotiate probably new leases. Who can help them do that? Well, the borough president. I want to create a Manhattan tenants union for both residential and commercial tenants, because there's so many tenants who have the same landlord and could share information and act collectively and be stronger and better off for it. So in short, I'm wanting to move the work from Albany to the city because I'll be closer to it. And this is really an important time. And I think we have to make certain we elect the right people during this municipal cycle.
So you've talked about the Marshall Plan for New York. Is this all part of your Marshall Plan?
It is. You know, that's a big name for something that really is very commonsensical, which is, again, going back to the enormous development pressures that I think we're seeing already. The governor, for example, wants to sandwich in 20 million square feet of new commercial office space around Penn Station. 20 million. Hudson Yards only has 18 million square feet. Can you imagine 20 more million in that 4-block radius? So that's an example of the pressure. I think the community boards need to get out in front of that. Our local community boards, everyone knows them, I think, on this Zoom, who really play the grassroots role as the kind of frontline members of our community who deal with these plans for development. I want every community board, and there's 12 of them in Manhattan, to institute what's called a 197A community rezoning, and to get out in front of the city administration or private developers with their own plans, which don't have to be comprehensive rezonings, but can be specific issues focused on through a formal plan in conjunction with the borough president. It might be homelessness or opioid addiction in and around Penn Station. And Inwood, it could be, you know, taking another look at the Inwood rezoning they passed and figuring out if it's still viable or there need to be any changes to it. On Roosevelt Island, it could be about, you know, really democratizing, you know, the planning and the board that, you know, oversees Roosevelt Island, and making sure that there's a greater number of people who are tenants and represent rank and file Roosevelt Islanders. And in NoHo Soho, it could be pushing back on a rezoning plan that could upzone parts of the neighborhood but not provide enough affordable housing. So that's really the heart of what I'm calling the Marshall Plan, which is community-based rezonings through the 197A formal rezoning plan. The borough president's office is the place. It's the office where those types of rezonings can be launched.
So you'd be giving a lot of power to the community boards. How would you be choosing community board members?
Well, the power of a community board is only advisory. it's only as great as the elected officials and the people in the city administration want to acknowledge their recommendation. I think we should heed their concerns more often than not. I'm not saying that every community board always gets it right, but certainly not every elected official always gets it right. But you're right that to point out that representation is really important as it pertains to a community board. And there are examples throughout our 12 boards of some things we need to reform and some areas, particularly in the appointments process, we need to focus on. In terms of reform, I find it hard to believe that we have these appointed members who serve on a very important public body, but you could be a paid lobbyist and serve on a community board. I find that kind of outrageous, and I would move to remove lobbyists from boards. I'd also prevent the paid staff of elected officials from serving on community boards. We really need to move away from someone who might or be perceived as having an outside interest serving on a community board. There's something called the Rooney Rule, which I think is really interesting, Ellen, in determining how to choose members to different boards. The Rooney Rule basically, you look at a metric and try to develop the most representative pool in terms of diversity. And if you have a bigger pool from which you choose community board members, you'll have more diverse boards. Our boards do underrepresent women, individuals who only have a high school education, Latinos, Asian Americans, transgender people, and younger people are underrepresented. I'm proud I sponsored legislation to allow 16-year-olds to serve on community boards, but we need to diversify the pool of applicants. And I would pledge to do that through that methodology, which is widely used now in corporate America.
Okay. I mean, I've been through that process about 4 times on the community board. I haven't been on the community board for about 4 years now, but it's quite an intense process. And I've been through 2 different borough presidents, 2 separate ways of being chosen.
How did they compare?
And I'm sorry?
How did they compare, the 2 different ways?
One was just interviews. The other one was table topics and watching how we work together as a group. And that they would give us, and interviews. So it's interviews and these table topics.
That was the independent screening panel, I assume.
And I'm sorry?
That was the independent screening panel, the latter one you described, where they had like civic, which one was Stringer and which one was Brewer? Are you able?
I didn't understand the question. I'm not understanding the question.
Which borough president chose you differently? Like which
Brewers was the table topics.
Okay.
And so
that sounds interesting.
It's very interesting because we saw how we, like who was a leader and who was a follower and who, thought how people thought through the problem differently. Mm-hmm. And the group was diverse. Mm-hmm. So it was an interesting project, but in the end I was selected again. So I mean, I don't think I did particularly well in that, in that group. But they all tried to like get proper representation. But I think we've had some very smart 16-year-olds on the community board. So it was good for them. I honestly don't know whether, how great it was for the community board at the time, but that's a discussion for another time. I thought that people that had a lot of experience on the community board had, really had a lot to offer, because they come to things with a lot of background and experience, so they thought through the problem a lot more, with a lot more depth. So I really see experience as being important on the community board. Would you term limit people?
Well, they are term limited now by virtue of the charter change that voters approved last year. I'm disappointed by that because I think experience is really important on a community board. I don't support term limits in any office. I don't know why we're cutting short, people's service. Judges too. The age of retirement is, I think, prohibitively short, and we're going to see a whole new crop of city council members elected this year. That's wonderful on the one hand. On the other hand, many of them are completely new to government, and we're losing a lot of veterans who knew how to get things done. I also worry that it empowers the permanent class of lobbyists and civil servants and undermines elected representative power. So, but it's a reality, and people, thanks to Ron Lauder, the term limit is a feature of New York City municipal elections.
Right. That is kind of a shame, but it is what it is, and I'm wondering whether it's whether it's useful for you to give up a place where you can really long-term make some really good progress.
Well, I think that, for me, it's a matter of staying fresh and taking on new challenges from a personal perspective, as well as the importance of the job. And, I wouldn't be running if I didn't think I was the best qualified with the best record. But it'll be good always, I think. And that's the upside to term limits, the infusion of new talent. And particularly in the legislative context, can be important and is transformative. We've seen it up in Albany where a new class of legislators, most of them under 40, many of them under 30, have completely changed the dynamic of Albany, along with the new Democratic control of the Senate, and allowed us to pass protections for tenants, codify Roe v. Wade, a woman's right to choose, pass the Child Victims Act for the first time, allow some accountability of law enforcement, and really set a course for acting on climate change. So that's the positive side of new talent and having fresh ideas.
Senator, you had mentioned that that the in your capacity as the borough president, that you'd be able to introduce legislation.
Mm-hmm.
I was under the impression that that the Manhattan Borough President was not allowed to introduce legislation. So
no, she can, and she has. I think Gail Brewer has passed a dozen or more bills as borough president alone.
Is there a specific type of bill that that you're allowed in the position, or
they have to introduce it in conjunction with a city council member? And they do not have a vote they do not have a vote in the chamber.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm really excited about having a team where we're creative and identifying legislative solutions, something I've been doing my whole career in public life, passing over 100 bills. I want to do something to that effect at the municipal level, because there's so much that needs to be done on a local level. For example, we need to get a handle on small businesses that are closing and being pushed out. I want to pass a bill both in Albany and in City Hall that would tax vacant storefronts. When a landlord keeps the space open, well, first of all, the landlord pushes out the small business, and rather than negotiate a fair lease, and then the space stays vacant for months and then even years. I think the landlord has to pay something for that, for pushing out a small business and, you know, creating that kind of externality to the community. We lose a small business and now we have a vacant storefront, and the landlord is just waiting for, I guess, a payout when they can find a longer term tenant. It makes no sense to me, and we have to disrupt that practice.
I think REOC would go broke
There
with all the empty storefronts we have on Roosevelt Island.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, now if the landlord, if the small business leaves or goes, or, you know, shutters due to no contract reason, then that's a different story. Then if it's the landlord's, you know, if it's no fault of the landlord that she or he does not have a tenant in a space.
So what would you do about the rents being way too high for businesses?
Well, for starters, I think this would be an incentive for the landlord to actually negotiate a more fair rent with his or her tenant. So that's one. Two, you know, there's been a long-standing push for something called the Small Business Jobs Survival Act in the City Council, which would basically force a negotiation between a landlord and a tenant in the commercial context. And third, you know, we've got so much vacant space in Midtown. I'm hoping that we pass rezonings that allow these spaces to be converted to other uses, namely supportive and affordable housing. And we're trying to get more money to commercial tenants so they can pay their rent, particularly those that have been suffering, of course, during COVID.
Yes, I was going to ask where would the money come from for conversion to of businesses in Midtown to residential? Yeah,
well, you'd have to structure it in a way that made sense for the market, of course, but I can also see, and I would hope to see, some state subsidy and city subsidy as a result. You know, the greatest affordable housing program in the state of New York was Mitchell-Lama, and we haven't created anything like it since, and it is really a shame. Instead, we relied on the market to try to provide us bits and pieces of affordable housing through mandatory inclusionary housing, you know, which is 75-25, or 421A, which is a big, basically, tax break for luxury developers who agree to build or fund a small portion of affordable housing. We need direct investment, Ellen, in affordability, and that requires a much more aggressive role of the city and the state. And as borough president, I would be pressing both the city and the state to do that. I think we're going to need a borough president who knows his or her way around Albany, because so much of what we need as a city flows through those two legislative chambers up there. I mean, you know, you can't lower the speed limit in New York City unless you get Albany's approval. I mean, it's crazy. I'm trying to change that actually right now with legislation I have to give home rule to the city of New York for their own speed limits. It would seemed to be the least we could do for New York City, much less allowing New York City to run the MTA, which I think is a really good idea, have control over rent stabilization laws, which I think is another important reform that we should pursue, and you know, play a greater role in our specialized high schools without being dictated by the folks in Albany.
So let me ask real quickly so that we can kind of sum it up, because I know you have to get on with other things. Can you give us what your, what's that?
Like putting my daughter to bed.
Can you tell us what your
She's
three top, what's that?
The longer we talk, the later she gets to stay up.
She's happy about it. What are the three top priorities that you have for your office should you become the borough president?
Thank you. That's very finely put. Number one has to be affordable housing. This crisis of unaffordability, where seniors can't afford to stay in this city, and young people can't afford to move here, is really going to cut the legs out from under our recovery. So that's number one. And again, I'm going to address it through an aggressive plan around organizing tenants to stay in their homes, converting commercial space currently, particularly in Midtown and parts of my district, to residential, and fighting for a more expansive city and state support for direct subsidies. Second would be the need to help our small businesses recover. Again, a third or half of them are going to be gone after COVID. I want to ensure that small businesses have the benefits of a tenant union and can negotiate fairly. I'd like a landlord vacancy tax to keep our storefronts active. And again, I'm going to be fighting for more subsidies for these small businesses in Albany, which is what I've done, including passing something called the Save Our Storefronts Act, which is bringing $800 million to small businesses through direct grants. And then third, arts and culture is a major priority of mine. Look, New York is what it is because of the creative class. It's why young people really want to move here if they can afford it, whether it's nightlife or a job in the creative field or being able to go to one of the best museums in the world. And on that front, I think, Joyce, what's so important is equity among our arts and cultural institutions. I represent a very wealthy part of Manhattan. We have the Whitney Museum and a new island that's opening soon off of the Hudson, which is inspired by essentially one individual. A wonderful thing, but I'd like to see more of that type of phenomenal artistic opportunity to be extended to parts of Harlem and Washington Heights and Inwood and Chinatown. We can do that through the borough president's budgetary authority, and we can also do it through a program that enforces equity among arts institutions with the cultural dollars that we distribute as a city. And then finally, we can spotlight it. As the borough president, I'll be able to hold hearings on this very important issue. But I also want to create a dashboard. I'm calling it Manhattan Stat. You have CompuStat, and this is Manhattan Stat, to look at city services and their disproportionate impact and level of service in different parts of Manhattan. And that will include funding for our arts and cultural institutions too. You got to, measure before you can manage a problem, and we really don't have a good handle on how we're underfunding many of those efforts in different parts of the borough that often get overlooked.
Well, we hear on this phone call certainly are most interested and hopeful that before you leave Albany, you'll co-sponsor our bill to define consent in the laws so that the Manhattan that you inhabit, the Manhattan that you become president of, is going to be a safer place. And we thank you so much for joining us this evening and being on the hot seat with us.
Thank you, Joyce. Thank you, Ellen. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Judge. Really appreciate everyone's activism on so many issues of importance, and the rights of survivors couldn't be more crucial to a fair and just society. And thank you, Judge, for all the work you're doing.
Thank you. And again, just an honor to be with you, Senator.
Thank you. I've been listening so closely to everybody. It's something that's so close to my heart, the work that Joyce is doing. And I'm just so glad to hear of all the steps and all the progression that's being made. It's really what you've done, Senator, is with the Child Victims Act is such an accomplishment. And I really hope we can carry this energy forward. It is a small victory, but Rome wasn't built in a day either. And I'm just so proud to be a part of this conversation. And if I can help you in any way, shape or form, I'm here to do that. And Joyce has all my information. I'm happy to be in the loop on everything, but I just want to thank you all for being here. And thank you for having me. We're good. Hopefully we can just have some small victories going forward. As Mimi mentioned, the jury in my case did ask for the definition of consent, and the judge, he was really, his arms were tied. It was just so sad to see that. It really was. And I felt almost like he was hamstrung. And I feel like even though this is a victory for victims, it's also something that the judge could have used as well. And I think at the end of the day, it will just inhibit predators knowing that there are rules and a definition for consent in the penal code. And so it's not just about victims, it's about giving judges the information that they need so a jury can come to a conclusion. And that's powerful. It's really powerful. I think, for example, in the first, I had to go through 2 trials, but in the first trial, I think things would have looked very, very different. And I wouldn't have had to go through what I went through on the stand a second time. So I'm fighting alongside you guys, even though I may not have a vote. I'm here as a voice and as an example. I saw it all unfold in court, and I was disillusioned, saying there's no definition. Unbelievable. So thanks, Joyce, for all the work that you've done to get us here.
Thank you,
I'm bringing such clarity as well, Joyce.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
Thanks,
You're really amazing.
Thank you. Thanks, Joyce. Thanks, Ellen.
Thanks everyone for being here tonight. And for those of us who are Manhattanites and New Yorkers, keep in mind that your vote is your voice. And we need to hear it loud and clear on June 22nd when we have our primaries. So please get out and vote. And thank you all so very much for joining us this evening.